So we've noticed that today is a special Shabbat in many ways. It's Tu B'Av, it's Shabbat Nachamu. And the other thing that we had that was very special was actually the very beginning of our Torah reading, which was the Aseret HaDibrot, the chanting of Aseret HaDibrot, and known as the Ten Commandments, although that's an interesting term for it. So we'll go into that a little bit. We can actually even start with that. So in Hebrew, we don't say Aseret HaMitzvot, we don't say Ten Commandments, we say Dibrot, which means statements or utterances. Some of them seem to be commandments, but not all of them. And at the beginning, for instance, we have, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That is not a commandment. So that's an identification of God. It actually goes back to an ancient style of relationships between kings and their subjects. That is, kings and gods and their subjects. In ancient times, when a king would identify himself, and I'm going to say himself because in ancient times, for the most part, it was only male kings, although there were some societies that were not so. So you have these sections, these moments in history where a king would identify himself and then lay out what the relationship is between the king and his subjects. So the relationship, and it's a very similar kind of document. I'm the king, and here's the things that you do, and if you do these things, then I will be the king for you. And we have the same scenario here in the reading of the Ten Commandments. God says, I am God, this is me, I'm God, the one that took you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. And therefore, these are the things that you do for me, and if you do these things for me, then I will be your God. And if you don't do these things for me, I won't be your God. And we see that this goes back and forth throughout Jewish history. When the Jewish people are not doing the things they're supposed to do, then God then retracts God's self from his presence with the Jewish people. And then when the people return to God, then God's presence then becomes more present and more obvious. But that's actually not what it's going to talk about. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit more about Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. Specifically, you would have noticed if you were looking at the Chumash that if you were trying to follow along with the sentences and the Ta'amei HaMikra, the trope, that it would have been very confusing because it seemed that when Ralph was reading, he just kept going on and on and on and on and not stopping where it seemed like verses are supposed to stop. So there are actually different readings of the Ten Commandments, and you have a handout here that shows you that. So if you look at that, we have two different trope sections, one that's called Elyon and one that's called Tachton. But before we even do that, I just want to talk a little bit about what's called trope. I think some of you know what this is. Many of you know what this is, but some of you are misinformed in some way or have a little bit of an inaccuracy about what the trope of the Ta'amei HaMikra really do. So, for instance, just by a show of hands, how many people think that the purpose of the trope is how you're supposed to chant something? Okay. Yeah, a fair number of you, right? Okay, so how many people think that that's actually not the primary purpose of the trope? Okay, right. So, yeah, so we have a split congregation, pretty normal in most scenarios. All right, so the trope really was created, called Ta'amei HaMikra. It was really created specifically as a system of grammar, a system of syntax, because obviously in ancient times, and even nowadays when you open a Sefer Torah, the things that you don't see are the things that were actually put there by most recently a group of people called the Masoretes, the Tiberian Masoretic setting of the Torah. And so they gave us things like, for instance, what we call vowels or points. You know, the kamatz and the segol and the chere, all those things. Those were not there originally. People knew how to pronounce the language. They understood the language, so they could open a scroll or any other written text and understand what it said. But sometimes it wasn't obvious or clear. And so the Masoretes then gave us this the vowels. They also gave us the syntax. That is, they gave us the places where we stop and where there are divisions within the sentence. So that's really the primary purpose of the Ta'amei HaMikra is to create an understanding of the text so that we're all reading the same thing. Because if you look at the text, you could read it, several different people could read it and pause in different places, and those different pauses will give us different meanings of what the text is really saying. It's like, how many of you have actually read Ulysses? You know that book, Ulysses, right? The one that goes on. It's if you know that book, Ulysses, is actually it's, I think, 900 pages without any periods or commas or. I'm sorry. Oh, Finnegan's. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. My mistake. Finnegan's Wake. Thank you. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Yeah. If you've read Finnegan's Wake, that's a book that there's no punctuation in it. So how do you understand it? The Torah is kind of like that, except that we kind of have a broader understanding of what it means. So the purpose of the Ta'amei HaMikra is to put those particular moments there, so we know when there are divisions and when there aren't divisions. We have a set of Ta'amei HaMikra, which these grammatical symbols function for the chanting and for the reading of the 5 books of the Torah, for the prophets, for the Megillot of Esther and Echa, and the other 3 Megillot that we read during the year, Kohelet, Ruth, and Shir Shirim. And these symbols are the same. There's actually a separate group of Ta'amei HaMikra for the Psalms with the same function, although less has been studied and less is known about those particular cantillation marks. But I want to give you an example of how we can understand the importance of the Ta'amei HaMikra. I'll give you 2 examples of it. One is the point where if you divide a verse in different ways, you have different understandings of the text. So we see in the Psalms there's a verse that we see in several Psalms, and the verse is Adonai Hoshea HaMelech Ya'anenu V'yom Karenu. I think you all know these words, Adonai Hoshea HaMelech Ya'anenu V'yom Karenu. So when we read it with that division, Adonai Hoshea, pause, HaMelech, slight pause, Ya'anenu V'yom Karenu, which means God, save us, please save us. HaMelech, that is king, which then refers back to God. Ya'anenu, answer us, B'yom Karenu, on the day that we call out to you. So God, please save us. King, that is God. Please answer us when we call out to you. Now, anyone that went through high school probably learned something in world history called the divine right of kings. Remember that? Remember that? Some people? Y'all went to high school, right? Okay. Divine right of kings. What does that mean? That means that according to the Church of England specifically, but essentially the Church of England, according to the Church of England, kings were kings because they were given that right by God, divine right of kings. And then the proof text that the church used for that was a reading of that same verse, but dividing it in different ways. So instead of saying Adonai Hoshea, HaMelech Ya'anenu V'yom Karenu, they read it this way, Adonai Hoshea HaMelech Ya'anenu V'yom Karenu. So if you divide 3 and 3, the meaning of the text becomes, God, please save the king, and then HaMelech Ya'anenu V'yom Karenu. So therefore, the Melech then refers to king. So God, please save the king, and then king, please answer us when we call. That would be the meaning of the text if you divide it that way. So this is why the trope is important. It tells you where the division is, so it makes sense. Otherwise, you have a different understanding of the text. Here's another example of the importance of the Ta'amei HaMikra, which is the following. Elias, I use your term, which is the following. Okay. So we read this morning Shema, and then the next section of the Torah. Now, you hear this all the time, and this is one of these things that actually makes me lose sleep at night. When people say, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. And that's actually a real important mispronunciation of that word, Ve'ahavta. Because if we break it down grammatically, the word ahav, is past tense to love, is to love. And it's like if I say ahavta, it means you loved in past tense. So if I say ve'ahavta, it means you loved. But the Ta'amei HaMikra that is, the trope gives us also something that's really important, which it tells you which syllable is accented in each word. And if you look at the Tamei Mikra, we realize that actually the accent is not on the second syllable. The accent is on the last syllable. So when we say ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, then it changes the tense of the verb and the meaning of the verb from past tense to what's called future causative or future command form. Ve'ahavta, you shall love God. So if you say ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, what you're saying is you loved God, past tense, nothing to do with the present or the future. But if I say ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love God, then now we have a commandment. We now have something that we're supposed to do. We understand our relationship with God based on the reading of that verse. So this is some of the importance of the Tamei HaMikra, if you pay attention to it and making sure that you follow the pronunciation. So going back to the Tachton and the Elyon, that is a higher set of tropes and a lower set of tropes. The rabbis created a higher set of trope for the reading of the Ten Commandments and a lower set of trope for the reading of the Ten Commandments. And if you look in the Chumash, when we read today, you see that actually both sets of trope are actually right there, and that gets very, very, very confusing, so especially if you're trying to learn how to chant it. Actually, if you look at the handout, what I gave you is the two times that this set of verbs, the set of commandments comes up in the Torah, in Exodus chapter 20, and then also in Deuteronomy chapter 5, which we read today, and we can see that there's you can see the difference between the trope. If you read what's called the lower set of trope, you end up each time with 12 verses, as opposed to 10. When you insert the what's called the higher set of trope, then you end up with 10 verses, which matches Aseret HaDibrot, which matches the 10 utterances of the 10 Commandments. So that makes sense. That makes sense. So the rabbis gave us these two sets. One of the sets, of course, the one that we read in public, which is the higher set, gives us, as I said, it gives us 10 utterances. But you'll notice that some of the verses are very, 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 very long that way. For instance, the verse about Shabbat is actually a very long run-on sentence. And also the second one, Lo hiya lecha Elohim acherim al panai, also is a very, very long sentence. So if you were to turn a sentence in like this to your English teacher, they would call it a run-on sentence. This needs to be 2 or 3 sentences. Doesn't make any sense otherwise. So that's one of the purposes of it. Now, we follow a really interesting tradition here, which is that I think for the most part, most of us are of Ashkenazi descent. How many people are Ashkenazi? Okay, yeah, the majority. How many people are Sephardi? Ooh, cool. How many people are Yemenite? Oh, yeah, you raise your hand. Yeah, excellent. How many people are Yemenite? Or what they call Oriental? Oh, yeah, Yemenite. Okay, cool. Right. So most of the time, I think in most conservative congregations across America, we follow the customs of the Ashkenazic Jews. But when it comes to the reading of the Ten Commandments, we actually follow what's a Sephardic tradition. And the Sephardic tradition is as follows. You notice that this morning we did 2 things. We stood up with the reading of the Ten Commandments, and we used the uppercase, the upper higher level of trope for the chanting of the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ashkenazic tradition, up until I would say probably 125 years ago or so, was not that. The only time that you stood up for the Ten Commandments and the only time you used the higher chanting of the Ten Commandments was actually on Shavuot. But on the 2 other times it comes up, that is during the year, in Exodus and also in Deuteronomy, you would just chant the 12 verses as written, and you wouldn't stand for that. So that's an interesting minhag that we follow. We follow that Sephardic tradition. So the other thing is that you notice when Ralph chanted, he inserted some special melodies for the ending of each of the verses. There's always a tradition of special melodies. So instead of a regular sof pasuk, a regular melody of ending the verse, it goes da 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 da. So that's the melody that we use for the conclusion. Now, the last thing I just want to talk about, and you can take these home and study them. There will be a quiz after Shabbat on this. Yes, I will check each one of you. So we also notice that, by the way, the reading of the Ten Commandments happens either 3 or 4 times during the year. I'm going to get to that in a second. So we know it's read on Exodus, on Deuteronomy, and also on Shavuot. But you notice that the reading between what we read in Exodus earlier in the year and what we read today, the text is different. The text is different. And I actually tried to highlight those in the yellow, some of those different verses. So for instance, in Exodus, we have Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. And in Deuteronomy, we have Shemor et Yom HaShabbat. And then there's, in the text for Deuteronomy, we know that this is a much, much later text, and we can tell that because of some of these various inserts. For instance, if you look at the Deuteronomy text, that says page 368 at the top of the page, it says Shemor, and then also Ka'asher tzivcha Adonai Elohecha, as God your God commanded you. This is not in the first reading of the Ten Commandments, so this is additional text that we don't see the first time. And then it says, L'man yanuch avdecha v'amatcha kamocha v'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. So we are reminded about, in the second reading, we're reminded about the fact that we do this, we observe the commandments because we were slaves in Egypt. The first time we don't have that text, and the reason for that is because the Jewish people have only been out of Egypt for like about 3 days before they get to Mount Sinai, right? So they get to Mount Sinai, they get the Ten Commandments. They don't have to be reminded that they were slaves, but later on in Deuteronomy, there has to be a reminder. And then also, we also have at the very end, just one other example, at the very end of the Deuteronomy text, it says, Lo titaveh beit re'echa en sadehu, that you're not supposed to covet the house of your neighbor and also his field. And the reason for that is because the Deuteronomy text was written at such a time that the Jewish people were beginning to settle the land and be living in the land of Israel. And so therefore they had property, they had fields, they had not just animals, but they also had places that they could plant vineyards and etc. So those words were added in as well. So it reflects a different time in Jewish history. So this is a little bit about the Aseret HaDibrot. I just want to point out one more thing. This is not the only time that the uppercase trope exists. And just for a second, just turn your Chumash to page 215 to Genesis chapter 35, verse 22. If you look at that for a second, on page 215, this has to do with Reuven. Page 215, let me get to there. Should have marked this first. Okay. So on page 215, we're looking at verse 22, and you can see that there are 2 sets of trope here. Vayehi bishkon Yisrael be'eretz hahi, vayelech Reuven, and then on the word vayishkav, you have 2 different trope signs. You have a zakef gadol, which is a line and 2 little dots to the right of it. But then you also have a line that's curved at the end of it, which is a pashta. So you have 2 different trope signs on that word. One is the higher and one is the lower. And then the next word, ed bilha, you have 2 different trope signs. You have a trope sign that goes like this, a pashta, and then you have a tipcha under the hay. So you have 2 different trope signs there. So this is the other time, the only other time in the Torah that this double set of trope appears. The rabbis are very, very clear in the understanding of why it appears here. They say, these are the trope signs, we have no idea. Okay, so if you have any questions, please text or email me, and I hope you learned a little bit. I hope I didn't talk too fast, and yeah, okay.